I am pleased to introduce our next session titled Navigating the Changing Business Landscape in North Macedonia, Building Resilient Businesses. Joining us on stage are Nikola Jurisic and our board member Venera Krliu Handjiski. The floor is yours.
Our session will be as much as about the outer world, like economic development, technological development, learning development, as it is about the inner world. So we'd like to invite everyone to start with a short grounding practice. You could call it mindfulness is a popular name in the World Economic Forum in these circles. So let's call it a mindfulness practice. So sit comfortably in your chair with your back straight. Feet on the floor. If you're comfortable to close your eyes, you can close your eyes. If you're not, of course, you don't have to. And first start by observing your breath. Is your breath faster? Is it slower? Don't try to modify the breath. Don't try to calm yourself down. Just observe the breath as it is, arising and falling away in the chest. Now shift your attention to your body, your physical experience. If there's any pleasant sensations in your body, free-flowing, easeful sensations, or if there's any contractions, any pain, any tension. Just do a quick scan of your body from your feet, up to your torso, and up through the head. If you notice anything, no need to change anything, you can just note it and know it. Name it, there is tension, there's a pleasant sensation, and just allow it to be there. Know that it's not you and it's not permanent. Now shift your attention to your mental experience, that part of you which thinks, thoughts, and just notice if these thoughts are coming in quickly, if there's a lot of different thoughts, if they're fragmented, if you're thinking about what to do next, what you did this morning, worrying about emails you have to answer, or if it's more placid, like a lake that is clear, peaceful, and accurately reflects the clouds above. And finally, shift your attention to the emotional part of your experience. Are there any emotions you're experiencing now? Two most frequent emotions we experience these days are some type of hyperactivation, speed, anxiety, or some version of disassociation. So just notice if you feel like your emotional experience is a little bit ahead of where you are or a little bit behind where you are now in this particular moment. And whenever you're ready, you can open up your eyes, for those of you that have closed your eyes, looking down.
Thank you very much, Nikola. Now you can give the attention to us.
Yeah.
I would like to present to you Mr. Nikola Jurisic. Yesterday I had the pleasure of talking to Nikola for maybe an hour or so, and I was very impressed. So I hope that by the end of the session, you will all learn a little bit of the things that I learned yesterday. Mr. Jurisic was born in Yugoslavia. When I asked him, how do you want me to introduce you to the public, he said, born in Yugoslavia and walking with the question of how is it that something like in the 90s can happen after more than 40 years of bratstvo i jedinstvo.
Yeah.
The organizations that have shaped you are both intellectual and spiritual, like London School of Economics, McKinsey Consulting, economist, and both spiritual, a coach, a facilitator. You spend more than 20,000 hours in coaching, workshops, and more than 5,000 hours in silence. This is very,
Thank you.
For us women especially, this is very challenging, but very impressive both. So you worked with McKinsey for 14 years. You served more than 200 organizations and government entities around the world on cultural transfiguration. Now you play two main roles. Business, you're a founder and managing director of Transfiguration Advisory, a firm helping to enlighten business leaders to have a beautiful and spiritual businesses. And also you're a founder of a Project Light, which is a movement to contribute to making life in the Balkans lighter by growing willpower, integrating the past, and education. A bit of a different topic than the last that we had from yesterday and today. So I would like to ask you the first question on if we can discuss the difference between the inner development or the outer development, because since the topic of the summit is the economic development.
Yeah, so I found it quite interesting to see the vision statement. And of course we have, Mike here, who was one of the original co-founders and a number of the co-founders here, that the vision statement focuses on economic development. And somehow, if you look at it in the world, a lot of our leaders spend time and attention on economic development, which of course is only one part of outer development. We also have technological development, scientific development, everything to do with matter in the external world. But then there's also inner development as sort of the flip side of that coin. And I'm a part of the global leadership team of something called the Inner Development Goals, the IDGs. It's a movement that started about 2 years ago to say we won't reach the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 SDGs, unless we also work on the Inner Development Goals, the IDGs. So these are two things we have to work. And in McKinsey, we would call this mindsets drives behaviors. So if you want to, and behaviors drive outcomes, and these are then performance outcomes. So if you want to change the performance outcome of your company, you have to look at the behaviors of your employees, and of course, starting with the leaders, because organizations don't change, people do, and it starts with the leaders. And behind that is, of course, the mindsets, the thoughts and feelings, pretty much the experience you've gone through just now, the physical experience, the mental experience, the emotional experience of the employees, of the average state of the employees. So it's a bit of an invitation also to all of us to look at both sides of the coin and to say, not that the outer is better than the inner, or the scientific is better than the spiritual, or whatever language we want to use, but we all know we have an inner experience. And we also know that there's an outer experience happening there that's more of a shared experience. You can also look at it, my experience, which is the subjective, and then the objective. But the subjective is not less worthy than the objective. They're both valuable, and we need to consider both of them as business leaders, as fathers, as mothers, and as citizens.
Relating now to the Balkans, now that you mentioned the mindset, we all know that we have traumas, let's call them Balkan traumas. So we find ourselves in crisis modes for decades. How do you think that we can move from all those crises to improve growth, inner growth?
I would say that's a walking question for me, in a sense, like I don't know the answer, but I've been thinking about the answer for about 2 decades now, and I will continue. And where I've gotten to so far is that, there's a few steps, but the first step is bringing awareness to the culture that is, as it is. Because of course, also in coaching or in therapy, the first step is always helping the client have an insight or a realization, or for the individual to say, yes, I have an issue. I need to work on something. So how do we move from a state of being unconsciously unskilled, in other words, like we don't know what we don't know, to starting to have a conversation around there are some forces, there are some, if you will, traumas that are shaping the culture that we consider to be normal. And it's like the fish swimming in the sea, there's just water around you. If I ask you what is water as a fish, you would be like, what do you mean what is water? Because that's just what's around me everywhere. So how do we start to bring light to the to the quality and the qualities of the water that we exist in here and that we were born into? Because many of the ways in which we relate with each other are not, loving or fully loving, if you will. So why is that? What is blocking our ability to send and receive love between people? And I've been walking with this question for a while. I can tell you where I've gotten to. So looking back into history, let's try to identify these kind of forces that are shaping the culture. So one of them is certainly patriarchy. And my understanding of people that have done the research on this and have looked at when is it that patriarchy actually came into the world, it came, at least in Europe, it came about 7,000 years ago. And this was the time of the old Europe civilizations like Vinca and the 4 or 5 other civilizations. And my understanding from the researchers at that time was that there was no power imbalance between men and women in those societies. The churches were in the middle of the village, not on top of the hill. There was no sign of weapons. They couldn't find any weapons when they did the archaeological digs. So 7,000 years ago, we lived in a state of harmony between the feminine and the masculine, both in terms of our own feminine masculine energies, but also if we have a female body or a male body. So patriarchy is one of these themes that's there. And you can see it showing up as hierarchy. You can see showing, people making decisions on our behalf. We spoke about this yesterday. Yeah. Parents making behalf on, you said you work in university, and parents come with you to and say, yeah, my child is going to be a lawyer. And then you say, why? Do you want to be a lawyer? And the child is like looking down, and the parents are saying, well, I'm a lawyer, and my parents were lawyers, so you're going to be a lawyer. And then you told me you get really angry, and you're like, no, the child should decide what they want to be.
I do, because life is about choices. So you have to give them choices since they're little, small, young.
But if there's a patriarchal power over you, it's difficult to step out of that and to say, this is what I actually want. This is my life, and I'm going to choose for myself. So patriarchy is one. And then we get to, of course, the Turkish influence here has been major in this region. And because it's a region that is sort of Samuel Huntington in The Clash of Civilization calls it a fault line region between 3 major civilizations. There's been a lot of movement in this region, a lot of instability, and that instability, in particular, let's say the 400 years of Ottoman rule, create this sense of the decisions are being made somewhere else, and I'm not an agency in my own life. So this tends to push people into a victim mindset. The decisions are being made in wherever, in the capital, right? Rather than here in my own town or in my own city. So there is this, and a second, I would say, collective trauma would be this sense of victimhood. It's always someone else's fault. It's the government's fault. It's, America's fault. It's, it's the bureaucracy. It's, the infrastructure. There's not enough money. It's always some external reason for which we cannot do the thing we know we need to do. So this sort of blame mindset, by the way, it's pretty common in corporates also. If you can come into any company and you can see the degree to which the culture is a blame type culture versus a creative, I take ownership for my own part. One of my friends calls it taking a radical focus on what you can control. So you radically focus on that area that you can control. And then you let the rest to others. And if all of us radically focus on what we can control, that tide lifts across the whole organization, across the whole company, across the whole country. So that's the second one. Then the third one we get to is the Age of Enlightenment. So we already touched upon this briefly, which is the scientific revolution, the Age of Enlightenment. Basically, when we said everything that's objective and measurable and scientific is valuable, and everything that's inner, subjective, emotional, partly because of all the religious trauma through the history, that's not valuable, and we don't measure that. That's not important. And then, how does that show up in companies today? Well, we focus very much on the numbers that can be measured, revenues and profits, and more we look at the short-term version of that specific KPI rather than seeing the whole picture, which is obviously much, much wider. And then you and I spoke about this. You look at medicine, who in medicine is the most valued? It's the surgeons. So forget about preventative medicine and everything you can do here. We're looking only at curative medicine, and the person that can cut your stomach open and take the thing out and actually materially affect that, like those are the people that are at the highest. And then you look at education. What are the subjects that are most revered and the most encouraged in the world? They're science STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and maths. And what are the subjects at the bottom? Things like dance and music and so on. And that's true around the world. That's true in Saudi Arabia, it's true in Singapore, it's true in Europe, it's true in the US. Because of this collective trauma from 300 years ago when we created this division between the subjective and the objective. So that is another force that shapes us. And of course, then here in the Balkans, we have, in the last 100, 150 years, we've had a lot of war. And that is a major, major influence also on the culture. We had the Balkan Wars, the First World War. I don't know how many of you know, but half of all men were killed, at least in Serbia, I know for Serbia the statistics, in First World War. So that's 25% of the entire population was wiped out. That's 4 generations ago, right? And then we look at Second World War, something similar happened again. In my own family, all of my family except my grandfather were wiped out in Second World War during the genocide. And this is 2 generations ago for me. So now when I feel like someone is taking something away from me unjustly today, this is like, I get so enraged. There's nothing that angers me more than when someone is taking something away from me unjustly. And then I started thinking about, okay, on the other side of my family, is there something? Yes, there was socialism. The communists came and took away all the land from my mother's side, while on my father's side, they took away life. So this is 2 generations ago. So this lives in me. This is not like it's somewhere, these ancestors, I am my ancestors. I am the continuation of that lineage. So it is for me to do this work. And if I don't do this work, it will perpetuate. This is what all the trauma research, all the trauma theory says. Oprah Winfrey recently published the top 10 books on trauma. And if you read the synopsis of the book, they all say what Carl Jung also says is that, and I'll use Carl Jung's words, which is unless we make the unconscious conscious, it will continue to repeat, and we're going to call it destiny. So we're destined to repeat these patterns unless, back to your question, we bring light to them, right? And there's many more. I mentioned 4 of these specific collective traumas, patriarchy and the scientific revolution and this influence of always someone in the outside and the wars in the last 100 years. But I started talking about this publicly about 6 months ago, and people come up to me and say, Nikola, this is not a topic in the public discourse. If you go to the newspapers and magazines and TV, people don't talk about collective trauma. It's just not a topic that we look at. But if you talk about it with people privately, everyone agrees that somehow this is the foundational issue. And somehow if we really work on these topics, then this will shift everything else. So it's just kind of, I don't know, kind of where to place it, right? But maybe it's just too early. But it's certainly, I would say certainly more and more people are, I would say, having the capacity to look inside and see what's there.
Yeah. Well, how do we relate your work with Transfiguration Advisory? With all these topics?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, in a way, it's interesting because it's the same process. The principles are very similar between organizational change and ecosystem change and national change. I can share 3 examples to illustrate this. First is one of my clients, which is the biggest, and this is all public, so I can share it. There's a case study that was published a couple of weeks ago. It's the world's biggest premium aluminum company. They're based in the Emirates. They're called Emirates Global Aluminum. They're about $10 billion revenue last year and $1 billion profit. So quite high profit margin for this particular industry. And they've gone on a 4-year journey to prepare for an IPO. And their journey was called Najah, which means success in Arabic. And Najah had 2 components. One is the performance, and second is the culture. So from the very beginning, they said, this corporate transformation of a metals company, so think of smelters and, hardcore manufacturing environment, is going to focus equally on the performance side as it is going to focus on the people side. Again, inner, outer, just corporate language for that particular context. And they had 3 phases, and I won't talk much about the performance side. They had 650 initiatives. They tracked them all through actually a McKinsey software called Wave. And McKinsey supported the transformation. And then when it comes to the culture side, they had three phases. And this is, I guess, pretty much directly applicable to most organizations. So the first phase is, what kind of culture do we want to have in this company to support this transformation we're going under in the next 10 years? And they defined a set of 4 values. And under those values, they translated them to what we just talked about in the last session, what they called specific behavioral competencies. You can call them skills, you can call them leadership competencies, you can call them whatever, but they're a set of specific behaviors that we want to train our employees to be able to behave in this way. Because if you leave the values at the level of the values, no one really knows what it means. So you need to make it translated into clear, measurable, concrete behaviors. So that was the first step. And they've done that over a 6-month period involving all the employees. So there were, I don't know now, something like 50 focus groups, hundreds of interviews. There was 2 surveys on the level of the entire company, 7,000 people, asking people, what kind of culture should we have? This is not something that we should just decide at the top of the company. This is a collective process because if it affects me, I should be involved. That's one of the principles of systems change. So I cannot say, oh, the CEO decided. Yes, he decided for the area that affects him or her, but if it affects me, I should be involved. Ask me. People like to be involved. And it actually it takes more time, of course, but it also creates a healthy foundation for everything else. So they articulated these beautiful branding, they had it. So this was one phase. It took about 6 months. Phase 2 was introducing these values on the company level. So they had a 4-month campaign for each of the values, and then a 2-month pause. So it took them 2 years to introduce. So they had a safety and sustainability for 4 months as a campaign. And they really did proper campaigns, activations, all the visuals. They do toolbox talks, which is the sort of frontline engagement in the actual smelter in the operations. And then phase 3 is what they're entering now, is to say, okay, so we know what values will make the biggest difference to our performance in the next 10 years, which is the values and behaviors, phase 1. Phase 2 is we've now introduced each of these values to everybody, and everybody knows what we mean by them. And phase 3 is let's now bring these values to life through the behaviors. So they picked 2 behaviors out of the 14 they have in their model that would make the biggest difference at this point in time, right? That's a bit of an art. You don't say, I'm going to bring to life all, behavioral change takes time. Our brains take time to hardwire, if you look at the neuroscience of it. So you pick 2 behaviors, and the whole company focuses on only those 2 behaviors for the entire year. You train people for those behaviors, you communicate for those 2 behaviors. Leaders do role modeling for those 2 behaviors. You align your incentive systems, you align your recruitment system, your performance management, like the whole outer system, all the signals. Sometimes we say behavior is contextual. shift the context to shift the behavior. So you need to shift, because people always behave rationally with respect to the context you've created for them. So if we look at governments and why are people behaving the way they're behaving, I always tell my government clients, if you come to McKinsey and I go to the government, I will within 6 months start behaving like you're behaving, because it's logical. And you will start behaving like me. You'll start working 18-hour days and weekends, and you're going to start performing, because that's the context that's established. So for us as leaders, the question is, what kind of context are we creating? Because people will respond to that context. And it takes time to shift the context. So that's why now they're going on this 5-year journey, 2 behaviors per year, to actually shift the culture. And then at the end of the 7-year period, you will have an irreversibly different culture. You reach a point of no going back. So that's a company example. Ecosystem example, and I'll speed up a little bit. I had the great pleasure of being asked by the Saudi Tourism Authority to help them open up the country to tourism. This was 2019. They were launching a program to allow 50 countries to come into the country, visa on arrival, no questions asked, which was extremely radical. If you know anything about Saudi, they were extremely closed for more than 40 years, and now all of a sudden, men and women without the abaya can come onto the airport and walk in. And when I first saw a woman walking out without an abaya from Riyadh airport, I was shocked.
They can drive now. They can vote now.
They can drive and vote, but yeah. I can only imagine what it's been for Saudis. I stood there and there's something wrong. There's a woman walking in shorts, out of in the plane, yes, because usually change in the airplane. You put in the abaya if you're flying from somewhere else, but. So it's a massive, massive culture change on a national level. So actually the client couldn't find anyone crazy enough to say let's do this national level culture change. And of course this is what I'm passionate about because of the Balkans. So I said so we've been on this journey now for 3-4 years.
They found a crazy Balkan guy.
Yeah, they found a crazy Balkan guy. And anyway, I won't go more into this case. There's a white paper that's written on this topic that was published 2 weeks ago around culture change on a national level in Saudi, and how did we work with the culture to make the culture more welcoming to tourists. And the results have been incredible. I mean, they tripled the amount of visitors they've had in the last 2 years, and the net promoter score for people that experience this culture that we've articulated, which in this case, their main value is called the hafawa, and the hafawa comes from this long tradition of welcoming visitors from all around the world to the Mecca and Medina also, which is they have this in their DNA, this welcoming culture. So of course, if you're doing culture change on a national scale, you cannot just invent a value. You have to listen to what's already, the beauty that's already in the land, in the people, and they've just forgotten, and then you amplify that, right? And that was the process. So every time you talk about the hafawa with someone, it's like a distant memory of something beautiful. Right? And that's how you can work with 2 million frontliners, because the tourism industry is 60,000 entities and 2 million frontliners that are serving tourists from the immigration desk to the airlines, to the hotels, to the different visitor sites, to the shopping centers, to the restaurants. There's a whole visitor journey in this process. So that was the really the most inspiring work I've done in the last 3 years. And then the third example is the Nordic Secret. Has anyone come across the Nordic Secret here? If you've put up your hand. Okay, Borko, because I told Borko about it.
Comes from McKinsey.
So this is, I always find this is a really fascinating example. So I looked at, or actually for the Saudi project that I just mentioned with the tourism industry, we did research to see what are the 10 most successful examples of culture change at a national or regional scale in the world over the past 100 years. And we looked at the US and we found how Mothers Against Drunk Driving halved the amount of deaths coming from drunk driving in the US over a decade. So we talked to Cindy Leitner, the founder of MAD. How did she do it? We looked at Maori rights in New Zealand. How is it that the Maoris went from being like a sideline population in New Zealand to all of a sudden becoming a proud part of the national culture? How did that happen? We looked at many of these examples. The most inspiring example is, how did the Nordic countries get to where they are today? Is it by accident? that they're just talented and they have great genetics, or like what's the story? And the story is very, very interesting. It actually starts in the 1860s, and of course it starts with the leaders, as always. And there was a set of enlightened leaders across the Nordics at this time who looked at the ideas of Goethe and Schiller and the German philosophers, which basically talked about the inner self. We need to do inner development, what they call Bildung, which is character development. So they decided that in order to help their country navigate the Industrial Revolution, which was coming from Germany and the UK, and for that to be an easeful transition, rather than to lead to conflict, as it has in some countries, they actually need to help people, what they called, find their inner compass. So they set up a network of 325 retreat centers where people went for up to 6 months in the 1860s to work on themselves. It sounds absolutely ridiculous, but it's a historical example, and the book, The Nordic Secret, chronologues that history. So, and it then lasted for about 60, 70 years. About 10% of the population in the Nordics went through these retreat centers for personal development. And effectively, this is the theory of change. Whatever change happens internally, because they're looking inside. They're not looking, because when you have a lot of change, people look to external authorities. And they say, who should I follow? What should I do? But if you have a lot of change coming, like we have now with the fourth industrial revolution and the metaverse and so on, if when there's a lot of change, people look inside and, connect to themselves and navigate from there, it's a much, much more resilient society, and we'll get much better outcomes.
Nikola, thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time is up, so I would...
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So if you would like to hear more from Nikola today at 12 o'clock, you have your own session. And also, you can either go have coffee now or stay and meditate with us. So it's your decision. Thank you very much, Nikola. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. So for those of you that wanted to stay, we had an invitation
Sorry,
do...
I'm just going to interrupt very briefly.
Okay.
I just want to mention that the refreshment area is located outside on the first and the second floor. We'll be back here sharp at 11:40 for the next session, for those of you that are going on break.
Venera and I will do a quick prayer. And that's only if you feel called, only if you connect to these topics. Only if you feel like you have the energy to contribute to this movement. And recently, at the end of last year, I was invited to do a prayer for starting a collective healing movement in the Balkans. And actually, this prayer was read out in 12 Balkan languages. So all the major languages from Greek to Macedonian to Slovenian to Romanian. We also did Russian, we did German, and English, as the languages that have shaped the region the most, and it was a very, very powerful ritual because, you'll see in the prayer as well. If we can just ask people who are talking to sort of, just to go outside if possible. Thank you. We appreciate it. Just to create a little bit of coherence here in the room. So we thought, given that we had this opportunity now, that we might invite those of you who feel called just to share this intention with us. So I'm going to find it here and read it out. And again, find a comfortable position for yourself, ideally straight back, ideally feet on the floor. You can close your eyes if you feel comfortable. Okay. A prayer. Starting the Balkan Collective Healing Movement. I read this prayer on behalf of people who have spoken and today speak the English language. I pray for the collective healing movement to start in the consciousness, in the hearts, and in the wills of people connected to the Balkan lands. People living in the Balkans today, people who have a personal, collective, or ancestral relationship to this land, and all the people from many countries and empires who have shaped Balkan history over the tides of time. I pray that we collectively acknowledge the ethical transgressions that have occurred on this land, that we find ways to connect, to correct and integrate this past, and let go of outdated labels and create new futures together. I pray that we feel each other, soften towards each other, and open up to each other evermore. I pray we sit together, break bread, and create spaces to grieve the rivers of pain we've experienced together. Repentance, forgiveness, and atonement. I pray that we find unity in our diversity and release the need to base our identity on our differences. I pray this process is gentle and respectful for everyone involved. I pray that more and more often, each of us starts to notice the judgments and hurts that come up in our minds and bodies, which are not ours and no longer serve us. I pray we do this work with great sensitivity, honoring the wisdom of our collective traumas, and act in service of the greatest good of all. I pray this collective healing movement takes all the time it needs, and I pray that it now begins. Founded on love, unity, and courage, I pray that it starts with me. Whenever you're ready, you can open up your eyes if you've closed your eyes, looking down. And thank you so much for joining us in this space.
Thank you.
Thank you.